Just prior to Russia's escalation in Ukraine in February 2022, three other violent incidents occurred that contributed to increased conviction among post-Soviet states that sticking with Russia may not be the best idea, not because it displeases the West, but because it's detrimental to their own security. The first was the third and last Azeri-Armenian War. Russia was supposed to defend Armenia as part of the CSTO agreement. We commented about it at the time during the World So Far Report series. As we speak today, Armenia is slowly but decisively heading towards some form of basically NATO membership. Perhaps I'll have to come back to this later on. The second incident was the gas revolution, later on named Bloody January in Kazakhstan. We covered that at length during this series and especially in episode 5. The reverberations of the gas revolution are still being felt in Kazakh politics and geopolitics. The third incident was the latest and now likely the last flare-up between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan that occurred just a month after I took these images. On January the 1st, 2022, ideas like exits from CSTO or a locally negotiated permanent settlement of the Kyrgyz-Tajik border dispute were unthinkable. In April of 2024, they're not just a casual conversation, but policy already. Armenia casually kicks out Russian troops from all over the country, and Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan have already settled about 90% of the border at the time of this recording, and they may finish the whole dispute by the end of this year. If you remember from episodes 1 and 2, only Kazakhstan has settled all of its border disputes, and all the countries in the region owe their border disputes primarily to the former colonizer, Russia that is. So in this episode, we'll look at these conflicts primarily around this circle, concerning these three countries, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the 12th featured installment of the Central Asia featured series. Now that we're done with the three countries toured, the rest of the series will cover things that were not studied on the ground, but in the subsequent months that have passed since the visit in the region. And in this episode, we'll take a closer look in the general region known as the Fergana Valey, which has been a source of conflict between Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan since the fall of the USSR. A classical post-colonial problem, only less fancy for the Western media to cover. Alright, so at the time of my visit in the region and when I decided the schedule and the topics for this series, the situation in this circle on the map was far more dire than it is now. In fact, the situation has changed so much for the better that if I were to do this trip again, I'd actually include a lot from this circle in the itinerary. But alas, I didn't in 2022 because the security situation was complicated. And just a month after I took these images, conflict between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan broke out again, thus confirming the concerns that I had and the reluctance to get too close to these borders. In addition to the logistical concerns, which were the main reasons I didn't include Tajikistan in this trip, but I will next time, and there will be a next time should I live long enough and still enjoy making videos. So, at the time of taking these images, there were over 1,000 kilometers of unsettled border between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, most of it in this circle. And just like multiple times since the fall of the Soviet Union in September 2022, just 3 weeks after I took these images, yet another conflict broke out. But this time was different. Unlike every single previous instance, the outcome was different. Unlike previous instances, at the end of 6 days of fighting and skirmishes, the elites of the two countries sat down and signed a peace treaty and committed to finishing the job of settling the border peacefully. Now, such talk happened in the past too, but this time they meant it. Since September 2022 and March of 2024, the two sides have managed to settle peacefully more than 80% of the disputed border. That's the fastest and the most consistent progress since forever. Not even the most optimistic analyst would have predicted this in September 2022. I would know, since this started just weeks after I had been in the area. I followed it closely and followed the most credible analysts in the region. Even the otherwise harsh critics of either President Japarov or Rahmon, or really both, have to admit that this is remarkable. And while the media focused on counting how many kilometers of border the two governments have been able to settle each month, the far more important question is, why now? You see, throughout this series, we looked at various facets of this region and how it was shaped by the Russian problem. This facet is no different, and if we had a moderately intelligent media, you would see this on TV. But we don't, so there's that. Here's the short version. After the debacle in Karabakh, in which it became clear to everyone that belonging to Russia's collective security treaty is worth less than the paper the treaty is written on, here you had two members of the CSTO, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, attacking each other. And in the past, Russia was able to help, or at least not make things worse. During the Tajik Civil War, and with the help of the United States, a peace agreement was reached, while Kyrgyzstan served as a safe haven for the refugees, as explained in episodes 2 and 10. But that was the Russia of Boris Yeltsin. Today, however, in the conflict, Russia is unable to do any of this, and the United States is less willing to care. The UN Security Council has forgotten that this region even exists, and, credit where it's due, the leaders of the two countries realized it in record time. But there are also several other reasons. One would be that Tajikistan has an even bigger problem to its east. China has been very bullish against this poor country and has been slowly and somewhat quietly conquering portions of Tajikistan. And by somewhat quietly, I mean nobody cared. Not even actors in the region, let alone the so-called international community. But more on that in episode 14. Another reason is the fact that there's an appetite for economic growth, and well, you can't have that without secure trade, and you can't have secure trade if nobody knows where the border is and you risk being shot at random. And finally, there's also the unusually happy context. Uzbekistan has a leader hell-bent on reform and opening up. Kyrgyzstan's president has little accomplishments to speak of, so fixing the border stands in stark contrast with the rest of his presidency, and this alone can get him re-elected, and staying in power can be a great incentive. And finally, in Tajikistan, there's a popular appetite for change, an appetite obviously not shared by the president, so also for reasons of political survival, or at the very least expediency, there's a bigger incentive now, and has been for the last 2 years, than it has been in the previous 30 years. Friendly reminder, President Rahmon has been ruling over Tajikistan for exactly 30 years, de jure, since 1994. And just like in Belarus, there is no apparent successor, although he'd wish to leave his son in charge. But unlike Belarus, Mr. Rahmon saw the writing on the wall, so he's not doubling down on dependency towards Russia. Whether that's a good thing or not is a separate discussion, and once again we'll get more into that in episode 14, when we'll also delve into the political impact of the ISIS-claimed terrorist attack at Crocus City in Moscow. In the meantime, let's take a quick look westwards too, to Uzbekistan. In episodes 7 and 8, I fleetingly mentioned that under Islam Karimov, Uzbekistan became more or less like a hermit kingdom with isolated foreign relations, and the worst of them with Tajikistan and Turkmenistan towards the latter years of Karimov's rule, at least in part due to the role of Tajik Islamists in challenging his rule. But then Karimov became a good dictator in 2016, and his successor, Shavkat Mirziyoyev, turned out to be much more open than even the most optimistic Uzbek analysts dared to hope in September 2016. Still, while the new leadership started immediately working on fixing its relationship westwards, towards Turkmenistan and further towards the Arab world and Europe, the opening towards Tajikistan seemed to never come. And then suddenly, in March of 2022, Uzbekistan unilaterally opened its border to Tajikistan, including in the disputed parts of the border. Just like that. The announcement was hidden between the lines of a generic COVID-19 ease of restrictions announcements. But, as usual with the pandemic project policies, few people looked closer at the political and geopolitical implications of policies which, yes, always mattered a lot more than the purported nonsense about so-called public health. I mean, friendly reminder, Uzbekistan stayed open throughout the pandemic project for international tourism. They never cared if you took shots or any of the nonsense seen in a lot of other Asian countries, with one exception, towards Tajikistan. So I could fly from Romania to Uzbekistan, but someone from Tajikistan could only cross through just 4 checkpoints and with a pile of so-called health paperwork, and even that didn't guarantee safe passage. All of that ended in March 2022, but alongside the nominally COVID-related restrictions, suddenly old, previously unused and long-time shut-down checkpoints became available again. And more was to come.
Потерял я любовь, не найду. Потерял я любовь.
When I was taping these images, just days after Xi Jinping's first foreign visit after the pandemic project, exactly in this place, rumors were circulating that transit towards Tajikistan will get better for both commercial purposes and people. Now, since Uzbekistan is not a democracy, there were and aren't no official channels to query for information, so you do it the old-fashioned way. You show up at the ministry at lunchtime and get into conversation with officials. That's how I found out that the regime is preparing to open up talks with Tajikistan. The guy that informed me was hoping there will be a comeback of the passenger train to Dushanbe because that would allow him to seamlessly visit his family that fell on the wrong side of the border back in 1991. What couldn't have been predicted was just how fast this was going to happen. Less than 2 months after I took this footage, in fact. From slowly whispered rumor to policy. Just like that. By March of 2024, commerce between the two reached unimaginable levels, likely in history. And also convinced me that I need to get back to this region, not only because I didn't get the chance to go to Tajikistan last time around, but also because Uzbekistan is a really nice place for a visitor, and it's slowly becoming a really nice place for the locals as well. Because this increased trade has also changed the migration dynamic. No more youngsters leaving for Russia for work. Sure, there's still labor-related migration, mostly from this region to Europe, but there's also return from Russia to work locally. Although, admittedly, when it comes to Tajikistan, it's also connected to the higher-than-usual levels of xenophobia in Russia concerning Tajiks. But that's a story for another time. And since I haven't been to Tajikistan with the camera, I'll leave in the description for you a video by the Russian channel True Story Travel that describes in great detail with footage how to cross the newly opened borders between Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, navigating this highly complicated geography. What I will say is that for the first time in decades, Tajikistan's remote areas are now suddenly subjected to visitors from afar, and not just from Russia, mind you. In the place I stayed in Samarkand, there was a German couple and 3 Brazilian guys who were leaving for Tajikistan the same day I left for Bukhara. That was also very uncommon prior to 2022. Also, in unimaginable things less than a decade ago, in February 24, the two countries opened up 2 gouging stations on the border to control the transboundary along the northern and greater Fergana canals, where there's also a huge hydropower facility. The hydropower facility was subjected to diplomatic tension and even occasional violence between the two countries from the 1990s and until 2017. This was also the first step towards normalization. Uzbekistan recognized the facility as being on Tajik soil, thus fixing about 100 kilometers of border, and in return for common management of the plant, Uzbekistan also resumed the supply of gas to Tajikistan, a move that enraged the Kremlin, but, as they say at the Kremlin, "Nu что делать? Ничего делать." In other news, towards the end of March of 2024, Kyrgyzstan officially warned its own citizens to avoid travel to Russia at all. Just 2 years ago, Uzbekistan's announcement that it would prosecute those who joined the Russian campaign in Ukraine triggered some diplomatic tensions in the region. Now, it's regarded as normal politics. It is quite hard to underestimate how much this region has been disconnecting from Russia, and not just politically, but economically, logistically, and culturally as well. As little as 3 years ago, joint energy projects between Uzbekistan and Tajikistan would have been regarded as difficult to achieve, and 10 years ago as downright impossible. Petty local egos and Russia's strong influence were enough to prevent any local collaboration. Now, the petty egos are still there, but the incentives shifted. It is now in the interest of the local ruling classes as well to continue the slow march away from Russia. And the biggest benefit from this is seen precisely in this circle. The peoples of this sub-region that fell into 3 different countries have been subjected to never-ending nastiness from the late 1980s and until a year ago. And given the high total fertility rate in the area, that means about half of the population wasn't even born the last time this area was at peace. And the last time this area had economic growth dates back to the early days of the 20th century, so nobody alive today even remembers that. Now, will this peace last? Well, it depends on who you ask. There are still a lot of skeptical voices, especially given the slow progress between Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, but we must not forget that the leadership in Tajikistan is old and focused on the northern border. Also, there's plenty of bad blood that has piled up. Until 2016, Uzbekistan officially held the Tajiks responsible for any and all terrorism, real or imaginary, happening in Uzbekistan. That leadership has been reshuffled with the death of Karimov, but the same thing did not happen at the receiving end. The leadership in Dushanbe is more or less unchanged since the late 1990s. So, long story short, this area is healing, slower than most optimists would think, but much faster than quote-unquote serious analysts had predicted. There will be more ups and downs, and this is all new territories for the elites in Tashkent, Dushanbe, and even Bishkek, although Kyrgyzstan is slightly more accustomed to this, being a democracy and all that. We'll get more into why in episodes 14 and 15. Until then, the next episode will be about the country least mentioned so far in this series, Turkmenistan, which will also be the most difficult video to make from the whole series by far, but hey, that's why you supported this channel, not for the easy videos for sure. And with all of that being said, thank you all for watching, thank you for your consistent and generous support. If you like this series, stay tuned for the next one, which will be about Southeast Asia, and consider supporting the Latin America Politics Tour. Links will be, of course, in the description. And with that, I'll see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.